Every married spouse strives to strengthen their marriage and make it even better. This is the work of two people, but my wife thought otherwise. She wanted to improve our bed life, so she managed to cheat on me more than 200 times. And all this is for the good of marriage. Karma caught up with her very quickly. Greg looked uneasy when I found him at the bar, but he smiled and said, "There you are, man. How about we grab a pitcher and sit in a booth?" Once we were seated, we chatted for a few minutes about the Reds and their chances this season. We agreed that third place was probably their best hope. About the latest political scandal, the mayor's chief of staff and the treasurer of the Catholic Diocese of Cincinnati sharing the same call girl. At least the story was original. And about the latest office gossip at Brockton Publishing, where he worked with my wife, Susan. However, I sensed that Greg had something on his mind, a reason for asking me to meet him for a beer. Finally, I said, "So, Greg, what did you want to talk about?" There was a brief silence during which Greg looked more nervous than ever. He cleared his throat and started to speak a couple of times. Then he said, "Listen, Andy, Susan said, she told me that." I just waited. His eyes were fixed on my face. I truly had no idea what he was going to say. "Susan told me that I should never mention this to you because you like to keep it completely private, so please forgive me if I'm overstepping. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. It's just that I need to be sure that you're really okay with this." "Okay with what?" I asked, still unsure what he was referring to. He looked unhappy as he licked his lips. "With, the game. The game that you and Susan play, where she. He made a vague gesture with his hands and looked at me, hoping I would finish his sentence. "Sorry, Greg," I said. "I still don't understand." There was a long silence. Greg stared at me, and I swear he turned pale. I gestured for him to continue, and finally, reluctantly, he said, "Andy, don't you know about Susan, Is she close to other guys?" Greg had joined Susan at Brockton Publishing about a year before, leaving a lower-level position at a New York publisher to move to Cincinnati. He was probably around 28, roughly 10 years younger than Susan and me. Greg was a tall, athletic guy, attractive in an outdoorsy way. He was single but had no trouble finding female company. In fact, I had seen him with several different attractive women at Brockton's book parties. Naturally, he got to know Susan first because they worked together, but I'd grown to like him a lot. We discovered a shared interest in baseball, which Susan found incredibly boring, and attended a couple of Reds games together the previous summer, having a great time. We also went to the same gym, and Susan and I occasionally invited him over for dinner. He was a good guy, and I enjoyed his company. Now, however, I felt my face flush with anger, and I said quietly, "Greg, just what the hell are you talking about?" Greg shrank back from me, across the booth. He was about 4 inches taller and 30 pounds heavier than I was, but he looked absolutely terrified. "Andy, I swear to God, she told me it was a game you played, that it turned you both on." This is unbelievable, man." He moved as if to get up from the booth, but I placed a hand on his arm. "Hold on, Greg." I took a deep breath and forced myself to speak softly. "I'll stay calm, I promise, and I'm not going to hit you or anything, but you can't just walk out of here. You have to tell me what Susan told you." He nodded and sat back down heavily. "Okay, Andy. It's just that, Jesus Christ, I can't believe you don't know about this." I stared at him, my mind spinning. "Susan told me that you two have a game that you both like. She's close to other men, and then when she gets home, she tells you about it. She also said that part of the game involves complete secrecy. None of the men she's involved with should ever mention it to you. We shouldn't have hinted in any way that we had a relationship with her or that you knew anything about it. According to her, it was more pleasant for both of you to pretend that it was a secret betrayal. And she mentioned that you felt a little embarrassed because you liked it when your wife spent time with other men. That's why she made me swear on my life that I would never say a word to you about it." But I just couldn't keep it to myself, Andy. It was too weird, and I had to consult with you to make sure everything was really okay. He must have seen from my face that I was shocked, and he looked even more unhappy than ever. Finally, I asked, "So you slept with Susan?" Slowly and reluctantly, he answered, "Yes, we did it twice, once 2 weekends ago when your mom got sick and you stayed overnight in Louisville, and again on Tuesday afternoon. We took a day off from work and went to my house." There was a long silence. My mind was filled with shock, rage, sadness, and self-flagellation. How could I not know about this? Finally, I said, "And she convinced you that I was involved in this, that I don't mind, and that this is just a game we were playing?" He nodded, relieved that my hands weren't around his throat. It sounded strange, I admit, but she was so convincing. She said that you guys have been doing this for many years, and that it really started your engine. He frowned. Actually, that's exactly what she said. It really turns Andy on. He's crazy about me when I tell him about it. And she gave me such a big smile. We sat in silence for a few more minutes. Finally, I spoke. "Greg, in case it isn't already clear, I had no clue about any of this. I thought I was married to a loving, wonderful woman, not a cheating liar. I need to think about this. I have no idea what I'm going to do. Needless to say, this has been a huge shock." I laughed bitterly. Then I leaned forward and looked at him intently. "Do 2 things for me, okay? First, no more sleeping with Susan." "Of course, Andy. I'd never—" Greg was nodding vigorously at me. "And second, don't let on that we've talked. If she suggests getting together again, just come up with some excuse. I need to figure out how to handle this. And I need you to keep her completely in the dark." Greg nodded again. "You have my word on it, Andy. And listen, I swear to you I never would have touched Susan if I hadn't believed it was what you wanted too. You're my friend, man, and I feel like a complete jerk." He looked at me with tears in his eyes, and I had no idea what to say to him. Should I be trying to make him feel better or grabbing a tire iron and beating him to death? After Greg left, I managed to compose myself enough to call home. Luckily, Susan hadn't arrived yet, so I left a plausible-sounding message saying I was delayed at work and that she should go ahead and have dinner without me. I knew I needed some time. There was no way I could face her right away. I went around the corner to a diner and ate a hamburger and a salad without tasting a single bite. For all I knew, it could have been borscht and a shrimp salad sandwich. I guess I was the typical unsuspecting husband because I had no idea anything was wrong with my marriage. I adored Susan and was certain she loved me. We'd been married for 14 years, had no kids, lived in a nice, comfortable house near Burnett Woods, and both had jobs we enjoyed. I work in the development office at the university. We traveled often, spent time with friends and family, most of whom lived nearby, and generally enjoyed our life together. Susan is a petite blonde with a gorgeous figure and striking curves. She's more pretty than pretty, but her physique has always attracted attention, and she seemed to like it. In fact, Sheet flirted with me at the party where we first met, and over the years I've seen her flirt with guys at other parties we've attended. She laughed and joked and sometimes danced too closely, and it didn't bother me at all, because I knew that she loved me and would come home with me. What a fool I was. I suppose our bed life was pretty typical for a couple like us. We made love maybe a couple of times a week. More often when we were on vacation, perhaps almost every day, and less often when we were busy at work or during the holidays, when we visited family. Maybe it was a routine, but I would call it a satisfying routine. Like every married couple, we both had our own preferences that helped us maintain our married life. So what if we often repeated the same thing in bed? I always thought it was great, although obviously what I was offering wasn't enough to satisfy Susan. You'd think that by the time I finished dinner, I'd be ready to go home and kick my unfaithful wife out of the house. But I wasn't ready yet. It was like the news that a loved one had died in an accident. My mind just didn't take in the news. I kept thinking that this must be some kind of mistake, and I realized that I needed to hear the whole story from Greg, everything Susan had told him, before I could start to process it and decide what the hell I was going to do. I didn't think that I could somehow pretend to Susan that everything was fine that night, but somehow I managed to do it. She greeted me warmly, as always, and we chatted about our workdays. She even snuggled up to me in bed, although thank God she didn't seem to want to make love. I really think that maybe, in the end, I would have done something terrible. As soon as I realized from her breathing that she had fallen asleep, I carefully pulled away from her and rolled onto my side of the bed. I didn't even want to touch her. That night I had terrible dreams, an endless series of men with whom my wife was cheating on me. Needless to say, it was a pretty terrible night. I called Greg the next morning, right after Susan had left for work, and arranged to meet him for lunch. Although he was initially a bit hesitant, I managed to convey that I needed to hear the full story. The previous night I had been too shocked to fully process everything he had told me. After spending the morning staring at my office wall, unable to concentrate on work, I met Greg at a small Greek restaurant on Calhoun Street. We agreed to eat first, and then I asked him to recount the entire story. Start from the beginning, Greg. You can imagine how difficult it was for me to handle it last night. In reality, I didn't learn much more. About 3 weeks earlier, Susan had gone out for a casual drink with Greg and basically made a pass at him. She had told him about our game and that she was attracted to him. He postponed meeting her that day, mostly because he was more shocked than anything. This story seemed incredibly improbable to him, and the idea that we would become close friends and at the same time be close to her caused him great concern. At least that's what he claimed. However, they returned to the subject a couple more times in the following days, and when she informed him on Friday that I was going to Louisville for the weekend, he agreed to meet her at a motel. Actually, she suggested our house, but Greg was upset by the idea. It's clear that Greg was hesitant to share the details of their meeting with me, but it was obvious that he liked it. I gritted my teeth but said nothing. I like talking provocatively while doing this, he said carefully, watching my reaction. She took pleasure in making obscene remarks about me, knowing that she would tell them to you later. I hesitated, not sure if I wanted to go deeper, but still decided to refrain from doing so. He was clearly uncomfortable, and I didn't push him any further. I had a suspicion that her other words were probably more explicit. However, I questioned him about everything related to their affair and its duration. Apparently, it lasted at least a couple of years. She didn't give details, he explained, but I realized that she had had relationships with several men before me. She mentioned that she always had one playmate, that was her term, and she was in a relationship with him for a few months before moving on. She mentioned that it became less pleasant for both of you to discuss whether it was the same person. You preferred to hear about someone new. He grimaced. I'm so sorry. I understand, Greg. She tricked you. Let's forget about it. Listen, did she mention anything about how it all started or who the men before you were? Not at the very beginning, he replied, but she mentioned a couple of names. None of the names meant anything to me except Arnold Morrison. The guy from the city council? Yes, Greg confirmed. She said she met him at a book party that Brockton threw in honor of some political book they published about 2 to 3 years ago. Susan also mentioned that you had never personally known any of her playmates before me. It sounded deliberate on her part, so you didn't have the slightest chance to reveal her activities. Did she explain her motives for pursuing you? Once again, he appeared uneasy. Well, she mentioned that she found me irresistibly attractive. He covered his face briefly. Andy, damn it, you must be furious with me. I feel utterly despicable. I replied firmly, Greg, I'm not holding you accountable. Many men would have gladly indulged with Susan without considering her husband. And she fed you this ridiculous tale. I can't say I wouldn't have fallen for it myself if I were in your shoes. The important thing is, Susan's been unfaithful to me. For years, it seems. She evidently enjoys deceiving me and having affairs." I leaned back, lost in thought. Greg remained silent. I had a multitude of uncertainties swirling in my head about what to do next, how to behave around Susan. Should I continue pretending to be a caring husband, oblivious to the truth? Was it time to confront her and kick her out? Or should I linger in sorrow for a while, letting her fret? Yet, one question had already found its answer. Our marriage was finished. Susan was a thing of the past. Well, she would be if Greg's revelations turned out to be accurate. Despite my shock and anger, I couldn't just unleash my wrath on her without being certain. I phoned my friend Brian and arranged to meet him for dinner. Then I left Susan another message, mentioning dinner with Brian and my late return home. Brian was my oldest and closest friend. We had met when he was the president of Zeta Beta Tau, the fraternity I joined in college. Our bond was strong. He was a groomsman at his wedding to Emily, and he served as my best man when I married Susan. He had known Susan nearly as long as I had, and I was aware of his and Emily's fondness for her. Thus, he was as taken aback by the story as I had been. As expected, Brian was amazing. He allowed me to narrate it my way, posing only a few inquiries as we progressed. He remained patient and supportive, silently offering me a napkin when tears began to flow. Ours wasn't the type of friendship where we expressed "I love you" openly, but I knew he was firmly on my side, and that meant a great deal. After I finished speaking, he quietly inquired, "Do you have a plan, Andy?" "I have two things in mind," I replied. "Firstly, I need to confirm beyond any doubt that this is true. It's still hard for me to believe I've been so certain that Susan loves me. And secondly, if it turns out to be true, Susan is in for a rough time. I'm not one to easily forgive and forget. We're finished, and the way I feel right now, it won't be pleasant." He nodded understandingly. "I don't blame you one bit." Then he asked, "How can Emily or I assist you?" "Emily. She and Susan were friends, though not as close as Brian and I were." "Listen, would you be willing to keep this between us, even from Emily, for a few days?" "Of course, man. We usually don't keep secrets from each other, but this is an exception. I won't say anything until you give me the green light." "Thanks, Brian. I really appreciate it," I said after a moment of thought. "The only other name I have for one of Susan's partners is Arnold Morrison, and I was hoping you could help me reach out to him. He doesn't know who I am, but he'd likely talk to you." Brian was a political writer, a columnist for Time magazine. However, he had spent nearly a decade covering politics for the Cincinnati Enquirer, earning respect from everyone in the local political scene. "Of course I can handle it," he said, and we spent some time discussing the situation. Later, we discussed how I should behave with Susan. Brian advised me to behave as usual and not let on that something was wrong until I was completely sure of the situation. I shrugged my shoulders and replied, "I'm not really sure I can handle it, but I'll try." As it turned out, I did almost as well as I did last night. Fortunately, Susan snuggled up to me again, but there was no intimacy. 2 days later, at 10:30 a.m., Brian and I found ourselves seated in Arnold Morrison's spacious office, facing him across his desk as he warmly greeted us. After exchanging pleasantries and engaging in some casual small talk about mutual acquaintances, he turned to Brian and asked, "So, Brian, what's on your mind?" Morrison, a tall man approaching his 50s, had a certain charm about him, though his polished demeanor reminded me somewhat of a typical politician. He possessed that characteristic knack of appearing genuinely interested and sincere, a quality often found in politicians. Was that what had attracted Susan to him? I couldn't be sure. "Arnie, I'm here to discuss a highly confidential matter. And I assure you that our conversation will remain private. You may know my friend Andy's wife, Susan Cullen." Morrison managed to maintain a composed demeanor, though his eyes betrayed a hint of surprise. He responded calmly, "I believe I've met her, Brian, but I can't recall the specifics of when or where." Leaning in, I pressed further. "Mr. Morrison, I'm not looking to cause trouble as long as you're forthcoming with us. But I know about your affair with my wife, and I need to hear the whole truth." Morrison remained remarkably composed, giving credit to his cool demeanor. After a moment of contemplation, he addressed Brian. "Is this conversation off the record?" "Completely," Brian affirmed. "This isn't for any publication, it's strictly confidential. It won't be written about, and it won't reach your wife. It stays between us." "And you're not recording?" Morrison inquired. "No recordings," Brian assured. Unbeknownst to Morrison, I had a discreet digital recorder tucked away in my jacket pocket, but neither of us disclosed this. Morrison sat silently for another moment, maintaining his composure. Finally, he let out a sigh. "I'm starting to think I wasn't given the full picture either, Mr. Cullen," he said, directing his gaze at me. "Am I correct in assuming you were unaware of my, involvement with Mrs. Cullen?" "Completely," I replied. "Well," he paused, then continued. "Yes, I did have a relationship with Susan. It was about 2 years ago. We met at a book publishing event, some sort of reception for a new book." Leaning forward, he fixed me with an intense look. "But I assure you, she told me that you were fully aware of everything. She even referred to it as a game. She claimed that you and she, or rather you and I, enjoyed her extramarital activities, that it added spice to your bed life. However, she also made it clear that you pretended to be oblivious to her affairs, and she strictly instructed me never to mention it to you. That wasn't a problem, since the likelihood of us crossing paths was low. Besides, I had no intention of my wife finding out, so we were very discreet." "How long were you involved with her?" I asked, surprisingly composed given the gravity of the situation. He pondered for a moment. "Maybe 3.5 months. It began in late spring, and I recall she ended it around Labor Day. She said it was enjoyable, but became less thrilling for her and her husband with the same person after a while, so she needed to seek someone else. The entire situation appeared rather unconventional to me, but Susan exudes a lot of sensuality. I never heard any complaints," he remarked. Seeing the discomfort on my face, he quickly added, I apologize. That was inappropriate of me to say." "It's fine," I replied, accepting his apology. I believed him when he implied that he thought it was all part of a playful scenario rather than aiding infidelity. I admitted to Greg that, under similar circumstances, I might have acted similarly, especially if I were single. "Where did you two meet?" "Various places. We had to be discreet. Given my somewhat public position, we couldn't risk being seen together. However, being on the council's public housing committee, I had access to keys for some of the city's vacant apartments in controlled buildings. I would simply claim my staff were conducting spot inspections. We typically met during lunchtime on weekdays and occasionally spent entire afternoons together." "Did you ever spend nights or weekends together?" I inquired. "A few times when Susan mentioned you were out of town," he responded, visibly uneasy. "I fabricated stories to tell my wife, and we stayed at your house." "I understand, Mr. Cullen," he apologized again. I nodded, choosing not to delve into the details of their intimate encounters. The thought alone was unsettling. "Did she ever mention her other partners, or how long she and I were supposedly involved in this?" "I recall her mentioning once that I was the 4th or 5th person she'd been involved with in such situations. She flattered me, saying something like, 'And you're the best of them all.' It was probably just talk, but it didn't bother me." We lapsed into silence for another minute. "Is there any additional information you can share?" I inquired. "No, I don't believe so. I apologize. he responded. I hold no ill will towards you, I assured him. Your actions regarding your wife are your own affair. Regarding Susan, I understand why you believed her. Morrison glanced at Brian. This stays between us, he reiterated. Brian affirmed with a nod, rising to shake Morrison's hand. You have my assurance, Arnie. Apologies for the discomfort, but my friend needed clarity. Of course, he acknowledged, escorting us out courteously. On the street corner, Brian halted and placed a hand on my shoulder. Are you all right? I exhaled deeply. Yeah. I anticipated what I was going to hear, it's just that, well, it's different to anticipate it and then have it confirmed. It's like the final confirmation, sealing the deal. Do you want to sit down and chat or grab lunch or maybe even go hit some golf balls? No thanks, Brian, I'll manage. I think I'll take a stroll in the park until I feel hungry, then grab a bite to eat before heading back to work. But would you mind if I treated you and Emily to dinner tomorrow night? I'm starting to formulate some plans, and it would be helpful to bounce them off both of you. Brian agreed, saying he'd arrange it with Emily. I expressed my gratitude once more for his assistance with Morrison. Having a genuine friend like him was truly invaluable. As I stepped out of my car in the driveway that evening, I found myself thinking, damn, another night of pretending I'm oblivious to what my unfaithful wife has been doing. But then a different thought struck me. Why should I pretend? I may not be ready to confront her yet, but there's no harm in unsettling her a bit. Susan was setting the table for dinner when I entered the kitchen. She greeted me with a bright smile, saying, Hey, honey, dinner will be ready in a minute, and blew me a kiss. I mustered a weak smile and retrieved a bottle of wine from the fridge. During the initial moments of dinner, she prattled on about her day until she started noticing my silence. Bad day, Andy? You seem unusually quiet, she remarked. Yes, indeed, I replied, meeting her gaze. Quite rough. Seems I'm learning that I can't always rely on the people I thought I could trust. I'm sorry, she said, her expression turning serious. Is it something at work? You've mentioned some issues with Hank's team recently. I think it's best I don't say more about it right now, I responded, cryptically, leaving the statement hanging. After a moment of staring directly at her, I rose without another word to clear the plates. As I moved around the table, I noticed her gaze fixed on me with alarm. Upon returning to the dining room with slices of the apple pie she had bought, her face appeared flushed, though she quickly composed herself and thanked me with a warm smile. We ate our dessert in silence initially, until Susan made a couple of awkward attempts to restart the conversation, first mentioning the new neighbors across the street, then discussing a vacation one of her colleagues had recently taken. After we finished dessert, she rose from her seat and approached mine. Leaning over, she wrapped her arms around me, pressing her cheek against mine. Would you like some coffee, or something else warm and comforting? She asked. I couldn't help but think. If only I had received such an invitation on any other night, not after discovering her years of infidelity, I would have been delighted. Instead, her offer only fueled my anger further. I stood up, breaking free from her embrace, and replied, No, thank you, I have some paperwork to attend to. Without a backward glance, I left the room and headed down the hallway to my study, leaving her to stare after me. I wasn't sure how much I had unsettled or frightened her, but knowing I had affected her even slightly was satisfactory to me. I had initially intended to stay awake late and enter the bedroom after she had fallen asleep. However, by around 10 o'clock I felt weary and questioned why I should be avoiding her in the first place. Consequently, I decided to prepare for bed. Upon entering the bedroom, I noticed she was already there, watching TV. I silently undressed, tended to my nightly routine, and slipped into bed, without uttering a word. Observing her promptly switch off the television, leaving only the gentle glow of my bedside lamp illuminating the room, I noticed she was wearing one of her more provocative nightgowns, which was unusual for an ordinary weeknight. Moving closer to me, she nestled against my chest and softly whispered, "Feeling up for some intimacy, Andy?" In response, I turned away, shifting so that my back was to her. While doing so, I replied, "No, not tonight. Good night," before extinguishing the light. Such behavior was entirely out of character for me. Throughout our marriage, I had rarely declined Susan's advances, only on a handful of occasions when I was afflicted with a migraine or had to prioritize completing a work project. Perhaps 4 or 5 times in total, and never without offering an explanation. My actions were a glaring warning sign, yet Susan remained silent. She didn't inquire whether everything was all right or if I was upset. She refrained from asking anything, undoubtedly fearing the inevitable conversation. Susan typically drifts off quickly, her peaceful breathing starting shortly after we switch off the lights. However, tonight was different. 30 minutes passed and she hadn't uttered a single word. In the darkness, I grimly smiled to myself. I wasn't sleeping either, consumed instead by thoughts of past instances where I unknowingly shared intimacy with someone else. I lay awake for a considerable time, my anger growing steadily. Early riser, quick shower, coffee in hand, and at my desk by 7:30, not a word to Susan. I had a packed agenda. Leaving a note on my boss's desk requesting a meeting upon his arrival, I busied myself making lists of credit card and bank accounts, potential movers, and other logistical matters requiring attention. At 8:15, Lionel popped his head in and asked, "Morning, Andy. Need to chat?" "Yes, thanks, Lionel. Can we step into my office for a moment?" I rose to close the door. Having worked alongside Lionel Brundage for close to a decade, I considered him both a friend and a superior, and I had made the decision to confide in him. "Please, keep this under wraps, Lionel. I've discovered Susan's been unfaithful, and I've made the decision to leave her. As soon as possible, actually. I need the contact information for that headhunter who reached out to you about me last year." There had been interest from an executive search firm, although the discussion didn't progress far, as I was content in my current position at the time. Lionel was taken aback, expressing his shock with a string of expletives. However, as we delved into the details, he quickly recovered and offered his assistance, as I had hoped. By 10:15 that morning, I had made contact with the firm and spoken with the individual who had reached out the previous year. By 10:45, I had faxed over my resume, and by 2:25, we were back on the phone discussing 3 potential positions. The standout opportunity among them was a fundraising role for a major nonprofit in Chicago. The responsibilities were similar to my current role, but with a larger support team, and the salary offered would be at least 20% higher. The position had been open for nearly 4 months, and they were eager to fill it quickly. I instructed the recruiter to inform the nonprofit of my interest and availability for an interview at short notice. As I was preparing to leave the office around 5:50, the phone rang and a deep voice said, "Mr. Cullen? I'm Ted Hruska from Global Resources in Chicago. I understand you may be interested in our fundraising position." We had an engaging conversation for almost half an hour, during which he invited me to Chicago to meet with the board. The trip was scheduled for 2 days later, and I gladly accepted the invitation. Having dinner with Brian and Emily was a mix of comfort and pain. It was comforting because it reminded me of the strong support I had from 2 wonderful friends, but it was also painful because I had to recount the story to Emily, reliving it once again. Emily was shocked, but her response was filled with sympathy and concern for me, alongside a strong anger toward Susan. "That woman," she muttered angrily, her fists clenched. "I can't believe." Her expression softened as she saw the pain in my face. "I'm truly sorry, Andy," she said, reaching out to hold my hand. "What can Brian and I do to support you?" "Just continue being my friends," I replied, wiping away a few tears. "I know I'll get through this, but it's tough right now. However, having both of you to talk to means a great deal." Brian gave my shoulder a squeeze, and they both expressed their willingness to assist me in any way possible. After finishing our meals, I outlined my plan to my companions. to accept a job offer in another city and quietly disappear. My aim wasn't to ruin Susan or shame her publicly. I simply wanted to exit the marriage, leaving her to wake up one day and realize it was over, her husband gone. That, in my view, would be punishment enough. I briefed them on the potential job opportunity in Chicago. It seems quite promising, and if it pans out, I'll likely take it. Then I'll vanish, leaving Susan to fret over my whereabouts. While I knew I couldn't evade detection indefinitely, I intended to confide in my new employers and request a delay of about a month before they made any public announcement about my hiring. Armed with a new cell phone number and email address, and with Lionel's cooperation at work, I was confident I could remain untraceable for a few weeks, ample time to inflict some distress on Susan. So when things inevitably go south, I'll need you guys to cover for me, as I expect. She'll turn to you first. Just tell her you're in the dark about the whole thing. Emily's smile turned grim. Can you believe I thought she was one of my closest friends? Andy, you know we've got your back. I can't wait to give her a piece of my mind when she shows up. That self-centered, cheating... Well, she admitted a bit sheepishly, I guess you can see how I feel about what she did. Does that mean I can trust you to stay faithful, babe? Brian joked. She lightly smacked his arm. You bet. And you'd better not be sneaking around either, unless you want a painful operation without anesthesia. We all burst into laughter, and our dinner turned into a laid-back evening filled with laughter and affection. For a moment, just a moment, I could almost forget the anger and frustration I'd been carrying for days on end. When I arrived home late, the bedroom was dimly lit, yet Susan was still awake. Throughout the workday, she had sent me a few cheerful, casual emails. However, my only response was a brief message, informing her of my late return after dining out, without specifying my company. Hey, sweetheart, her voice greeted me in the darkness, sounding pleasantly relaxed and sleepy. In that moment, I was painfully reminded of my love for Susan and how attractive I still found her. If only this situation were just a bad dream. If only I could believe she remained a faithful, loving wife and lose myself in her embrace. How was your dinner? I missed you tonight, she said. It was fine, I replied curtly. I dined with Brian and Emily. It's comforting to have trustworthy friends. She sat up, her question left hanging in the air. Like the previous night, she was hesitant to initiate a conversation she wished to avoid, leaving her feeling trapped. Tough luck, I silently remarked to myself. Without saying another word, Susan patiently waited as I prepared for bed. Once I lay down, she turned towards me, silently reaching out to hold me in her arms. Last night, darling, you disappointed me, she whispered in my ear, clinging to me. Is there any chance that I can show some tenderness tonight? I chuckled to myself. I'm sorry, Susan, I replied, pulling away from her embrace. I'm still preoccupied with the problem I mentioned earlier, and I'm just not in the mood. I could almost hear her mind racing. After a pause, she said, Okay, honey, I understand. But I hope we can be close soon. I really miss you. She gently patted my arms and shoulders before moving to her side of the bed. Again, it took her quite a while to fall asleep, and for me, even longer. Over the next few days, things progressed rapidly. My journey to Chicago for an interview with the Board of Global Resources went smoothly, and I accepted the job, set to begin in 10 days. I promptly informed Lionel, who was understanding despite the short notice. We agreed that I would continue consulting with him part-time for about a month until my replacement was fully onboarded. I owed him a lot, and I assured him that I wouldn't let him down. 4 days later, I returned to Chicago with the assistance of a real estate agent recommended by Ted Ruska. Together, we found a pleasant one-bedroom apartment just minutes away from my new workplace. After signing the lease, I quickly visited a furniture store and purchased enough to furnish the apartment. I arranged for delivery through the building superintendent to ensure everything would be ready upon my arrival. I also coordinated with Eileen Stambaugh, my future administrative assistant, to shop for essentials like bed linens, towels, and kitchen supplies. Eileen was delighted to assist, especially after I promised her dinner at Chicago's finest restaurant. By the time I made my second trip back to Cincinnati, there wasn't much left to do. I had to clear out my office at the university, pack my belongings from the house, and handle all financial matters related to separating my life from Susan's. Most tasks could be completed in my office, and by Friday, everything was sorted except for the packing. Susan didn't have any specific reason to worry about my trips out of town since they were quite common for my job. However, my distant behavior definitely made her anxious, and I found amusement in observing her struggle to understand what was happening. She avoided addressing the issue directly, probably fearing that I might suspect her of being unfaithful. Instead, she tried to show affection and love. But my abrupt rejection of her advances clearly distressed and frightened her. Emily called me at work, gleefully informing me that Susan had contacted her to inquire about my strange behavior. "I found it quite entertaining, Andy," she exclaimed. "Susan confided in me about all the peculiar ways you've been acting. Ignoring her affection, refusing intimacy, dropping hints about some undisclosed problem." I inquired if there was anything she might have done to upset Andy in some way, and she reacted with a gasp, replying, "No, I'm not aware of anything." Following that, I asked if she had insisted on him disclosing the issue, to which she hesitated and mentioned she didn't want to pressure him too much, believing he would share when he was ready. It was clear what she was apprehensive about. Here she was, attempting to extract information from M.E. while concealing her own reprehensible actions. I shared Emily's satisfaction with the conversation and requested her to keep me informed. Additionally, I conveyed that I was almost prepared to take action. Monday would be the chosen day. Over that weekend, I persisted with my enigmatic and aloof demeanor towards Susan. My resentment towards her remained unabated, and I was resolute in ensuring that my final moments with her were as unpleasant as possible. I kept my interactions with her to a minimum, responding to her friendly gestures with abrupt coldness. When she suggested going for a walk on Saturday, commenting on the beautiful afternoon, I simply stared at her and declined, citing a lack of interest. Her proposals for activities on Saturday night, such as dining out, catching a movie, or socializing with friends, were met with my insistence on staying home and watching TV. Later, when she cuddled up beside me on the couch, I abruptly stood up about 10 minutes into the show we were watching. "I just remembered I have a couple of reports that need urgent attention," I said, before disappearing into my study. I stayed up late waiting for Susan to fall asleep. On Sunday morning, I woke up to find her snuggled up to me, gently kissing my neck. When I opened my eyes, she greeted me with a smile and said, "Good morning. You're awake and our baby wants to play." She tried to kiss me, but I held her back by putting both hands on her shoulders. "Susan, please stop," I said firmly. "I don't insist on intimacy when you're not in the mood, and I expect the same respect from you." I carefully moved away from her and got out of bed, reaching for my robe. She looked worried. "But honey, I do not know. 2 weeks have passed since we were close. I did something wrong. Are you upset with me?" It was the closest she came to directly addressing my behavior, which indicated her growing desperation. "I'm not sure, Susan. Why don't you enlighten me? Is there a possibility you've done something to upset me?" I stated calmly, yet icily. There was silence. Susan averted her gaze. Eventually, she responded, "No, darling, nothing comes to mind," and glanced up at me pleadingly, hesitant to continue. "All right then, I suppose we're finished," I remarked, and proceeded to the kitchen to prepare coffee. Susan must have been spooked by our conversation because she avoided me for most of the day afterward. I overheard her making several phone calls, presumably seeking advice from a friend, or perhaps a lover, trying to figure out how to deal with me. While she was out running errands, I quickly called Greg to inquire if he had been in contact with Susan. He informed me that she had approached him at work 2 days prior, asking if he had seen me recently. She mentioned that you seemed preoccupied and distant, but she acted clueless as to why. So I simply told her I hadn't spoken to you. It seemed like the easiest solution. And then she mentioned she was eager to resume our game, but suggested it might be wise to wait a bit until she understood what was bothering you. I feigned disappointment but agreed nonetheless. Thanks, Greg. Things are about to blow up. Please, whatever you do, don't let her in on our discussions. All right? Greg reassured me he wouldn't spill anything to her, and we hung up. On Monday morning, after breakfast, Susan went into the bedroom to get ready for work, and was surprised to see me in a tracksuit and sneakers. Andy, aren't you going to the office today? No. I have some things to settle at home, so I decided to take the day off. She looked at me and, after hesitating a bit, asked, Well, since you're not in a hurry, do you think we could, play a little? She smiled warmly and added, I wouldn't mind being a little late for work. Looking at her, I deliberately forced myself to imagine her with someone else, perhaps Arnold Morrison or some unknown man, writhing next to him. My beloved wife is the woman to whom I have dedicated my life. That was enough. No, I don't think so, I replied, and without saying another word, left the room. I went down to the basement to get my suitcases, and only came out after I heard the sound of her car pulling out of the driveway. By 11 a.m., I had packed all my belongings into 3 suitcases, along with a couple of boxes containing books and CDs. I called a taxi, which waited while I sent the boxes to my apartment in Chicago from the post office, then took me to the airport. By 7:30 p.m., I was unpacking in my new place, and afterward, I treated myself to a pizza and a beer at a nearby place. Reflectively, I raised my glass. Here's to the beginning of a new chapter. My new chapter, without Susan. Oh, I almost forgot. Just before leaving, I penned a brief note to Susan, leaving it on the kitchen table along with my wedding ring and cell phone. The note read, I've learned about your deception. So here's my response. It's called Farewell to a Deceitful Partner. My initial week at my fresh job was both absorbing and draining, which was oddly satisfying considering how much I yearned for Susan. Not that I desired to be with her. That chapter was closed. Every thought of her ignited a raging fire within me. It was almost awe-inspiring how perfectly grotesque her betrayal had been. However, harboring anger and despising her didn't erase the longing I felt. I had cherished her for years, adoring every facet of her. Such emotions don't vanish abruptly. Instead, they intermingle with new sentiments, love and hatred swirling together like clothes in a washing machine. In retrospect, I was grateful that global resources kept me occupied. By the week's end, I was thankful to return home, catch a bit of a ball game on TV, and collapse into bed. Yet, the weekend proved challenging. As a newcomer to Chicago, I knew hardly anyone beyond my colleagues and had to confront the reality of being single once more. Not legally, but in every other sense. I understood that I had to initiate the process of building connections, making friends, and possibly finding a new romantic interest, and the thought was overwhelmingly disheartening. The highlight of those 2 days was the conversation I had on Sunday with Brian and Emily. They were incredibly supportive and eager to catch up on how I was doing. I shared my new contact information with them, once again emphasizing the need for secrecy. Emily couldn't wait to share her encounter with Susan. She called us on Monday evening during dinner, sounding nearly hysterical. Her tears made it difficult to understand her, but eventually, I grasped the words. He's gone. Andy's gone. She was completely distraught, so I offered to drive over to her place. When I arrived, she was a mess, hair disheveled, makeup streaked from crying, barely coherent. I fixed her a drink and played the role of a sympathetic friend. It was quite entertaining. I let her pour out her heart, describing how she returned home from work to find you gone, leaving your wedding ring on the table. I inquired about any notes or explanations you might have left. Then, Emily recounted with delight. She looked at me, crying even harder, and confessed, "Oh, Emily, I cheated on him." I feigned shock, exclaiming something like, "No. Susan, how could you?" I pretended to be furious, pacing around the kitchen, glaring at her. She appeared guilty and terrified. Eventually, I declared, "I'm sorry, Susan, but I can't stay here right now. I care about both you and Andy, and I'm appalled by what you've done to him. He was the kindest, most loving." Then I simply said, "I'll speak with you in a few days once I've cooled off." And I left. I left her standing there in the kitchen, tears streaming down her face. Even over the phone, Emily's satisfaction was palpable. I anticipated Susan's frantic search for me, secretly hoping that her inability to find me would drive her crazy. The more I longed for her, the more it fueled my anger. How could she, the person to whom I had devoted so much, act so selfishly and leave me in such misery? Over the following 2 weeks, I kept in touch with Brian and Emily, who served as my support system. I shared about my experiences in Chicago, my new job, and occasionally the loneliness and emptiness I felt. They patiently listened and encouraged me to persevere, providing great comfort. Susan called them daily, desperate for any information about my whereabouts. According to them, she sounded desperate. I also reached out to Lionel, who informed me that Susan had visited him the day after my departure, nearly collapsing upon learning that I'd quit my job and left without leaving a forwarding address. After 3 weeks in Chicago, I accepted Brian and Emily's invitation to return to Cincinnati and spent the weekend with them. It was a welcome opportunity to unwind and temporarily escape the emotional burden I carried. During Saturday's dinner, Emily recounted Susan's recent visit. "She came by on Thursday, still searching for you, still completely desperate. She's considering hiring a private investigator to track you down. She believes that if she can just speak to you, she can make you understand and forgive her." I raised an eyebrow. Highly unlikely, I'd say. But I'm curious to hear her side of the story. Did she confide in you? Emily's eyes sparkled. "I told her, Susan, you've been lamenting Andy's absence for 3 weeks now. We've been friends for years. When are you going to tell me what you actually did? How serious is it?" "And did she tell you?" I asked eagerly. "Well, Andy, I'm all ears. Let me spill the beans," Emily replied. That evening, I learned a great deal about my wife, none of which I wished to know. Emily started with Susan's first instance of infidelity, with a charming British man she met at a book party. He engaged her in conversation throughout the event and later invited her for a drink. Emily recounted. So she informed him that she was married and couldn't simply leave with him. However, instead of rejecting him outright, she inquired about the hotel where he was staying and then agreed to meet him at the bar there in an hour. They had a drink, went up to his room, and ended up in bed together. I sat there gazing out the window. This wasn't exactly surprising news. I already knew she had been unfaithful for years, and there had to be a first time. But it stung nonetheless. Did she give a reason? I asked her that, believe me. She seemed embarrassed and admitted, "I was bored. I know it's no excuse, Emily, but it's true. Andy and I had a good life and a decent intimacy, but it was always the same. Nothing special or different. So predictable, you know. And then there was this attractive guy with a charming accent, and I thought, wow, this will spice things up." She mentioned that the intimacy was pleasant, nothing extraordinary, just exciting because it was someone new after so many years. She also said that next week she will try to have intimacy with you, as often as possible, and it will be better than usual. Then she said, she convinced herself it was a win-win situation. She could have affairs from time to time discreetly and carefully, which would improve her bed life with you at home, and everyone would benefit from it. Can you believe that nonsense? Over the next hour, Emily told me the rest of the details. Susan gradually made it a rule to have casual contact with a different man every few months. At first, these meetings were one time, but after she was close to her fifth or sixth partner, she wanted to continue dating him. Their relationship lasted 3 months until he married another woman. Emily said that Susan realized that the thrill of extramarital affairs increased with subsequent meetings as she and her new partner became more adept. As a result, Susan's strategy began to include short romances, lasting 6, 10, or perhaps 20 meetings until interest subsided. "When did the game start?" I asked. "It arose when one of her partners began to show possessive feelings," Emily explained. Susan was aware that her lovers might become overly attached to each other and threatened to reveal their affair to me. To prevent this, she decided that if her partners believed that she had entered into an extramarital relationship with my knowledge and consent, they would understand that she had no intention of leaving me and that she was not subject to blackmail. Emily noticed that Susan was proud of this plan and even giggled when talking about it. Brian handed me another beer, and as I gulped it down, my mind filled with dark thoughts. Emily's words echoed in my head, confirming my worst suspicions, and the pain was indescribable. Feeling like a complete fool, realizing that she had greatly underestimated the man she loved and trusted more than anything in the world. How could I be so naive? She was bored. I mean, seriously, don't all married couples have periods of boredom? But how to react correctly? Shouldn't it be, "Honey, let's find some interesting ways to shake things up? Maybe a vacation, some new toys, but don't sleep with other men." I couldn't remember ever being bored with her, although there were times when intimacy seemed routine. It was still nice, but routine. And I would be more than willing to experiment with something new, but I've never had the opportunity. No, Susan decided to diversify her life, not ours. When I was preparing to fly back to Chicago on Sunday, Brian inquired about my plans regarding Susan. "Are you going to leave her hanging, wondering what's going on with you? Or do you intend to resolve it once and for all?" I shook my head. "Honestly, I'm not sure yet. Maybe a combination of both. Perhaps I'll let it linger until she tracks me down, then set up a pleasant surprise." I shared my thoughts with him, and he grinned. "That sounds ideal, Andy. I only wish I could witness it myself." To my surprise, it took several more weeks before Susan managed to locate me. Brian informed me via phone that she had proceeded to enlist someone's help in finding me, so I presume that's how she eventually succeeded. Frankly, I wasn't too bothered by it. However, upon returning home from work on Thursday, I was greeted with a lengthy, meandering voicemail from Susan. "Thank goodness I've located you, darling. I'm deeply sorry, truly sorry. I love you more than anything. Please, allow me the opportunity to explain. I miss you immensely. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. You know you're the only man I love." And so on for another 5 minutes, all in a similar vein. Every word was entirely predictable, and none of them lessened my anger in the slightest. I couldn't fathom what she expected. After repeatedly betraying your spouse for years, you don't just get to utter a casual apology and expect forgiveness and reconciliation. "Sorry, Susan, it's just not going to happen." It seemed like the appropriate moment to initiate my endgame. I was aware she would persist in calling. Simply ignoring her wouldn't suffice in the long term. The following day, I treated my assistant, Eileen, to an extended lunch. She had evolved into a close friend and was already acquainted with the unfortunate circumstances surrounding my abrupt employment at Global Resources. Eileen, a pleasant woman in her middle years, was married with 3 children and exceptionally astute. Unquestionably the finest assistant I had ever worked with. Over lunch, I disclosed my plans for Susan, and she burst into laughter. "Andy, I adore it. It couldn't be more fitting," she exclaimed, thoroughly amused by my proposal. "Well, I'll need assistance in locating someone. I'm not quite sure," I began, but she cut me off. "Let me give it a shot, will you?" she interjected. "I have a few ideas. Just give me a couple of days before proceeding with anything else." I raised my eyebrows in surprise. Really? She nodded, beaming, and I responded, well, all right. But this isn't exactly the typical task one assigns to their administrative assistant. We shared a laugh. Susan persisted with her calls, ringing me up at least every other day over the next fortnight. Though her voicemails became briefer, they lacked any new content, failing to reignite my interest in engaging with her, let alone considering forgiveness or welcoming her back into my life. One Monday, as I prepared to leave work, Eileen appeared at my doorway. I've found someone perfect for you, she announced. Just let me know when and where, and I'll pass on your address. I regarded her skeptically. Will I actually like this person? And who is she, Eileen? How did you manage to convince her this isn't exactly the usual— Shh, she interrupted, flashing a grin. She's perfect and eager to help. I briefed her on your situation and she's raring to go. And you won't tell me who she is? Nope, she replied, her smile widening. But trust me, boss, you won't be disappointed. The following day, I left a message on Susan's voicemail. Hey, it's me. If you're up for a talk, you've got one shot. Saturday, 1 p.m. at my place in Chicago. Don't be early or late. You've got an hour. Here's the address. Drop me a message back to confirm. That evening, I ignored a call, opting to listen to Susan's enthusiastic voicemail instead. Oh my God, thank you so much. I love you. I'll be there Saturday, no doubt. Thanks for this opportunity. I'll make you understand, I promise. I'm truly sorry for everything and I want to spend the rest of my life making it up to you. And so on. The following day, Wednesday, I talked to Eileen. I've arranged for Saturday at 1 p.m. Can you ensure your mysterious lady arrives by noon? Absolutely, she replied. But you've got to promise to fill me in afterward. That's my reward. Emily conveyed to me over the phone Susan's immense excitement. Andy, I swear, she's completely oblivious. She genuinely believes she can win you back with just an apology. I can't believe I've been so deceived by her. We've been friends for nearly 15 years, sharing everything, our spouses, our careers, our families. And now, to discover her selfishness and cruelty, though she probably doesn't see it that way, it makes me question how blind I've been. I chuckled, tinged with bitterness. Emily, think about how I must feel. I've been married to her all this time. I suppose the real lesson is that people like us, decent, trusting individuals who genuinely care about others, often assume the rest of the world operates on the same principles. And Susan isn't. On Saturday morning, I dedicated my time to tidying my apartment meticulously, aiming for an ambiance that reflected a contented bachelor rather than a victim of circumstance. I ensured newspapers were disposed of, books orderly arranged on shelves, surfaces dusted, and every corner spotless, even adorning the table with flowers in a vase. At just past noon, when the doorbell chimed, I greeted the visitor with a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. To my surprise, it was Christine. "Hello, Andy," she exclaimed with a hint of amusement. Or should I say, surprise, Andy. Christine Hansen, a program officer at Global Resources, was among the first acquaintances I made at the workplace. Roughly 8 years my junior, she exuded charisma and charm. Standing almost 5'10", Christine possessed striking features, jet black hair complemented by captivating green eyes. Her demeanor, while elegant and stylish, also conveyed warmth and approachability. Undoubtedly, she was one of the most captivating individuals I'd ever encountered. Initially, I was taken aback by her beauty, yet amidst the tumult of adjusting to a new job and city compounded by personal turmoil with Susan, my focus was elsewhere. Nevertheless, thoughts of Christine lingered as our paths frequently crossed at work, her demeanor consistently affable. Though I couldn't discern if her kindness stemmed solely from her outgoing nature or held deeper significance. I knew she wasn't married, but it seemed unlikely that someone as stunning as Christine didn't have a partner. So, I relegated her to the status of a colleague I admired and enjoyed looking at. It hadn't even crossed my mind to inquire with Eileen about her relationship status. Now, as she surveyed my apartment with a pleased expression, I was completely bewildered. Christine, Eileen did brief you about today, didn't she? About my wife and, my plans? She grinned widely. Of course. She motioned to the bag she brought along and said, I've got everything I need right here. But, you... I was still uncertain. Still stunned, actually. You understand that you'll be... I'll... This time, Christine chuckled and affectionately rubbed my cheek with the back of her hand. Yes, Andy, I understand. Eileen filled me in on your situation, what you discovered about your wife and all. Her expression grew more solemn, and she continued. Let's just say I went through something similar with my ex-fiancé, a little over a year ago, so I can relate to how you're feeling. I'm sorry, I said. I had no clue. Well, it's not fresh anymore. I've moved on. But it was pretty terrible at the time, and I would have given a lot to be able to confront him like you're planning to with Susan. She laughed. So, how do you want to arrange this? I proposed we grab lunch first, so we spent around 30 minutes enjoying sandwiches at my kitchen table, casually getting acquainted. I already knew Christine was attractive, but that meal reaffirmed she was also intelligent, humorous, and considerate. I pondered whether she might consider going out with me, but that was a question for another time. Around 12:45, I suggested, Christine, if you're ready for this, perhaps it's time for you to head to the bedroom. I'm prepared, she replied cheerfully. We established our cue, then she gave me a kiss on the cheek. Andy, this won't be easy. She was a significant part of your life for a long time. Don't expect it to be smooth sailing, but I'll do my part, I promise. With a smile, she vanished into my bedroom, leaving the door slightly open. I grinned to myself as I tidied up the dishes and awaited Susan's arrival. Having Christine instead of a stranger involved in today's events was a delightful surprise. At 12:58, the doorbell chimed, and I braced myself for what was about to unfold. There stood Susan, mustering a brave smile amidst her evident fear, yet radiating beauty. Adorned in an ensemble she knew I favored, her makeup meticulously applied and sporting what seemed like a fresh haircut. Hello, Andy, she murmured softly, as if inclined to embrace me. I instinctively retreated, gesturing her inside. Hello, Susan, I replied, matching her subdued tone. Care for a drink? I busied myself in the kitchen for a moment, fetching sodas for both of us. My heart raced, a blend of love and anger surging within. I needed to regain composure and navigate through this. Seated at the table, she leaned forward, imploringly reaching for my hands, but I kept them firmly on my side. Fine, Susan, you're here, I'll listen, but I can't say you deserve it. She inhaled deeply. Andy, I'm so sorry. What I did was unforgivable, and I know I've hurt you deeply. I was selfish, blind, and foolish. Stop, I interjected, raising my hand. I don't want to hear apologies, declarations of love, excuses, or justifications. Don't insult my intelligence. You cheated on me repeatedly for years. Am I right? Taken aback by my intensity, she hesitantly nodded. But, darling, Do you recall our wedding vows? I demanded, interrupting her once more. Forsaking all others? Do you remember agreeing to that, Susan? She nodded, her complexion draining of color. She appeared taken aback by the turn our conversation had taken, although I couldn't fathom why. What did she expect me to say? No problem, honey. All right, then. We pledged lifelong fidelity to each other, and then you decided at some point, oh, to hell with that, and began sleeping with whomever you pleased. Tell me, Susan, how many men were involved? I'm not sure, baby. 10, 20, 50. I don't know. Maybe around 20, she said, visibly uncomfortable. And how many times have you had meetings with them? How many times have you betrayed me by letting other men do things to you that only I am allowed to do? I leaned back, realizing that I was breathing heavily. My face probably turned red too. I'm not sure, baby, she said, looking for sympathy. Tears welled up in her eyes. Figure it out, Susan. Do the calculations. I'm not in a hurry. Probably it will be maybe about a couple hundred, she said, avoiding my angry gaze. Okay, we'll stop at 200, a good, even number. Now tell me, how many of these cases have we had at home? In our bed? In our marital bed? I was practically screaming. She replied softly, I am probably about, I don't know, Andy. Maybe 30. There was silence. So now that we've addressed that issue, just to clarify the subject of our conversation, please go ahead and elaborate. Susan, explain to me why, given your actions, I should continue spending time with you. Because I love you, Andy. You're the only man I've... Her voice broke into sobs, her words interspersed with tears. The only man I've ever loved. You're everything to me. I allowed her to speak, allowed her to cry and plead with me, expressing her love for me, admitting her selfishness and a terrible mistake she had made. She believed I would never discover it, and she never intended to hurt me, as if not intending to hurt me made everything acceptable. It unfolded just as I had anticipated. None of her words made any difference. They only reinforced my perception of her as an incredibly self-centered, narcissistic individual, more so than I had ever realized. After a while, I tuned her out. Her voice became background noise to my own sorrowful thoughts, reflecting on the years I had devoted to our relationship and the dreams I had of us growing old together. Anger mixed with sadness within me. What a waste. And I came to the realization that I would never truly understand why she did it. She seemed unaware herself. She couldn't provide any explanation that resonated with me, beyond sheer, almost psychopathic selfishness. Glancing up, I saw it was 2:05 according to the kitchen clock, and I couldn't endure much more. Or didn't want to. In a firm tone, I stated, I believe we're finished here, Susan. There's nothing more to say. Susan's tears began to flow again. Andy, I can't believe that you are... We were interrupted by a noise coming from my bedroom. We both turned around to find out what was going on. My jaw dropped, and I heard Susan gasp softly. Darling, you said you'd be done with her in an hour. When are you going back to bed? It was Christina. Her voice was quiet, relaxed, and irresistibly attractive. She was standing in a graceful pose, leaning against the doorframe of my bedroom, which was wide open. Her lipstick was smudged, her hair was tousled. Dressed in a long, almost transparent pale blue negligee, she exuded a timeless charm, reminiscent of the toga of a Roman aristocrat, although much more open. She was the epitome of sensuality. Turning to Susan, I found her frozen in place, clearly stunned. Her face paled, and she seemed to withdraw into herself, shrinking and aging before my eyes. She shook her head in disbelief, repeating, No, no. I rose to my feet. Christine is correct, Susan. I promised you an hour. And as you can see, I'm rather occupied. Or at least I will be again shortly. I offered her a cold smile, observing her struggle to stand. Andy, Susan started, then halted. She glanced at Christine, then back at me. I didn't realize you... Her voice trailed off, and she simply stared at me, motionless. Without another word, she stood up, tears streaming down her face, walked to the apartment door, opened it, and vanished down the hallway. I shut the door behind her, then turned to face Christine. Christine, I uttered almost in awe, you're the most astonishingly beautiful woman I've ever encountered. She smiled, lowering her gaze. Thank you, Andy. It seems this, indicating her negligee, had the desired effect. I noticed her eyes were brimming as if she were on the verge of tears. You shattered her, I remarked. She realized she was outmatched. Thank you immensely. As I continued to look at her, I could hardly find the words. Susan had all but vanished from my mind. It helped me too, you know, she confessed. In a strange, indirect way, like I was reclaiming something from Harris, my ex-fiancé. I'm glad, I replied, then added, forgive me, I can't seem to look away. Would you like to return and change? She simply gazed at me and something shifted in her eyes. Actually, she said, I was hoping you'd assist me with that. I sometimes struggle to remove this thing. She chuckled at my surprised expression and approached, wrapping her arms gently around my neck. I mean it, Andy. It feels right. Like the next step in our story. For both of us. And then she kissed me, so softly and tenderly that it brought tears to my eyes. Making love to Kristen was wonderful, like a dream. The serene aftermath, with her nestled sleepily against me, felt truly heavenly. I hesitated to utter a single word, whether of affection or gratitude, fearing it might disrupt the enchantment. So we lay together, me basking in blissful happiness, hoping she shared the same sentiment. After perhaps half an hour, she softly mentioned that she needed to leave and got up from the bed, gracefully unclothed. I moved to follow, but she gently urged me to stay put. No, it's all right, Andy, just rest. She vanished into the bathroom with her clothes, and when she reappeared fully dressed, she came to sit beside me on the bed. Leaning over, she smiled and tenderly kissed me. I didn't plan for this to happen, in case you were wondering, she told me. But after overhearing your conversation with her, I decided I wanted to. I decided it was the right thing. Was this a farewell kiss, I pondered? Was she subtly indicating that it was a one-time occurrence? I couldn't discern, unsure of what to say. Thank you, Christine. That was the most loving, the most generous, and beautiful gesture anyone has ever made for me. Returning my smile, she replied, I did it for myself too, Andy. And you did me a world of good, not just for my ego either. And with that, she kissed me once more, repeated, No, don't get up, and disappeared from the apartment. I slept for a couple of hours, exhausted from the run-in with Susan and making love with Kristen. It was a real lovemaking, I was sure of it. It wasn't just revenge, and it was much more than a simple consolation on her part. I woke up around 5 a.m. and wandered aimlessly around my apartment, absent-mindedly tidying up, feeling a little dazed and thoughtful. Suddenly, not allowing myself to dwell on the questionable wisdom of my actions, I found Christina's number and called her. Hi, this is Andy, I said, feeling a sudden wave of nervousness. Hi, Andy, she replied, and somehow I could hear the smile in her voice. I hope this didn't seem too strange to you, I began, not quite understanding what I was getting at. You were so kind, and so incredibly sweet and attractive, and, well, I just needed to thank you again and tell them how special you are. It wasn't weird at all for me, she said. It's just amazing. I'm not usually this direct. And, I guess what I'm saying is that I need you to know that I don't usually jump into bed with men. I never would have thought. I could say that it was something special. I finished awkwardly. Listen, I said, getting ahead of myself. Would you like to have dinner with me tonight? There are so many great restaurants in Chicago that I've never been to, and I'd love to take you to one of them. There was a short pause, and I froze in anticipation, suddenly afraid. After the longest 5 seconds of my life, she said, Yes, actually, that would be very nice, Andy. I would love to. We talked a little bit about what kind of food, which restaurant, when and where I would pick it up. It seemed like it was really going to happen, and I felt like I was smiling all over my body. Then she said, Andy, after dinner, you can, Is it okay if I come and stay with you for the night? I had been inviting Brian and Emily repeatedly, but it took 3 more weeks before they found a free weekend to visit me in Chicago. They stayed in one of the nice hotels downtown and let me show them around: the lake, the museums, and Wrigley Field, which Brian was eager to see. On Saturday night, we were having drinks in the bar at the Fairmont Hotel, waiting for our dinner table. I was entertaining them with details of my final conversation with Susan. Not that they hadn't already heard most of it over the phone, but we were all enjoying my retelling. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I jumped up, smiled into the most beautiful pair of green eyes I'd ever seen, kissed Christine, and said, "Emily and Brian, I'd like you to meet Christine Hansen. Christine, this is Emily and Brian O'Halloran." They greeted each other as I helped Christine sit and ordered her a drink. We started making polite conversation, but I noticed Brian was unusually quiet, just staring at Christine. After a couple of minutes, he interrupted me in the middle of a story. Gesturing to Christine, he said, "My God, Andy, you really landed on your feet." We all burst out laughing, and fortunately, no one laughed harder than Emily. She was aware that she wasn't as beautiful as Christine, but she also knew that Brian adored her, and his admiration of Christine didn't bother her at all. As we headed in for dinner with the 2 women walking a few steps ahead of us, Brian quietly asked me, "So you and Christine are really, a thing?" I nodded. So far, so good. Honestly, I have trouble believing it myself. And she's not just beautiful, she's the whole package. Generous, funny, affectionate. Brian already knew some of the story, particularly that Christine was also recovering from being cheated on. He said, "Well, I guess your shared misfortune turned out to be a bit of luck in a way." I don't know about misfortune. It feels more commonplace than that. More like both of us getting screwed over by selfish jerks. "Well, whatever," he said. He placed his hand on my shoulder. "I'm really happy for you, Andy. It really seems like things are working out okay. More than okay." I smiled at him as we moved towards our table, following the 2 lovely women chatting together. "I'm living the dream, pal," I said.